Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Insights with Elite Mind Academy. This is where we talk about some of the topics and issues that might stay behind closed doors in the wellbeing industry. And we like to cover issues in as much depth as we possibly can. This week, we're talking about inclusive policy. And so we have our expert guest with us who is going to be joining the discussion and sharing his wisdom. And that is Dez Wilson. Dez has a background in mental health, has worked a lot with children and young people, enabling participation for people with lived experience. Much experience that kind of gives him the authority and the information to be able to talk about what we're talking about today. Des, I'll pass over to you to kind of elaborate on that introduction, because no doubt I can't cover everything, but it's lovely to have you here.
Thanks, Valentina. Hi, everybody. Yeah, that was a great introduction. I guess my experience really is very much about person-centered practice, if I want to use an umbrella term. I guess I'm really passionate about making things accessible for people of all abilities. Equality, diversity and inclusion is something that's very close to my heart. And, you know, coming from the background of working in mental health and supporting many vulnerable people over the years, I've witnessed and been a part of many policies, both in writing policies and working with the policies. And I've seen some excellent practice and I've seen some really poor practice. And I guess really one of the things that I want to bring into the conversation today is the absolute value in working with people rather than doing to people, because it really can bring magical transformations to any organization when you get it right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Des. And in that spirit, please do participate with comments in the chat. Would love to hear from you. Would love to hear your take. If you have any questions for Des or for myself, I'm Valentina. I'm head of Insights and Impact at Elite Mind Academy, and lead on some of our research and development in that area. So yes, please do get in touch and share your thoughts and your experience as well, if you feel comfortable. So another thing to just be aware of is that we'll be talking about inclusivity and also then experiences of exclusion and how that may impact mental health in a negative way. So just to be aware of your own sensitivities around those things, and please do protect yourself. Feel free to tune out if it feels like we're leading into an area that might be triggering or difficult for you to hear. But I think it's important to kind of clarify the terms of engagement, I suppose, or the kind of the topic that we're covering today. So thinking about actually equity, diversity and inclusion and accessibility more generally, would you mind kind of giving just a little bit of a summary of what those things or those words mean to you, and kind of how that then, plays out in a professional atmosphere?
Yeah, I guess equality really is about equal opportunities for everybody, regardless of their life choices, their place of birth, their ethnic background, their identity, any one of the 9 protected characteristics from the Equality Act 2010. And it's about just making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to participate in and I guess get involved in things in the workplace. Since we're talking about workplace practices here, we'll frame it in that way. Diversity, again, really what that's about. It's about celebrating variations and differences in people. Again, that can be related to the 9 protected characteristics, but really it's about just understanding what is it that makes us unique as people and how can we celebrate that, and how can those unique traits and differences come into our workplace environment and really offer us a different perspective in the way that we're working. Because I guess for me, I think if we do what we've always done, we get what we've always got, right? So if we're always listening to the same people and the same voices, whether that be a room full of white, middle-aged adult males or a room full of, young female Black women, whoever those demographics are, it's about, you're only going to get one side of the table, aren't you, really? So it's about let's bring in that diverse cohort of voices, if you like, and let's get an overall perspective so that we can really get a handle on how we should be doing things better. And that's where inclusivity comes in. So I think really inclusion for me as well is about not sidelining people. Sometimes when we're in the workplace, we can do that inadvertently without realizing it. That can possibly be down to things like language. It can be down to our practices. It can be down to the way that we operate, our body language, the way that we look, see, and hear with and to our people. And I guess really we all owe it to ourselves to be really aware of how we're operating in any one moment when we're around our colleagues. And also to take an interest in our colleagues. We'll work with them every day. Yes, we're there to do work, but wouldn't it be a great thing if you took an interest in who you sit next to and perhaps know something about them and really take an interest in something about them so that you learn to understand who you're operating with and how you can get the best out of these people in that working environment. So really, inclusion for me is about values. It's about really valuing people, and it's about respecting individuality in the workplace. Now, of course, there's varying degrees of what that looks like in terms of good practice. And I suppose this is what we're going to explore in today's conversation, what that looks like. I'll even go for excellent practice. I think we should all aim for that. And then if we fall short, at least we'll be somewhere good, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. I think we should always be kind of trying to achieve beyond, achieve it all as much as we can. And we can use, certain things. I think you mentioned the protected characteristics, and I think that can be a really useful starting point. But I also really love that you kind of allowed the definition to expand beyond that, because we're looking at really being as diverse and inclusive for potentially all of those people or traits or backgrounds that we might not have thought of yet in our current legislation and in our current policies. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit later about person-centered practice and about participation, and no doubt some of this will come into that as well. And so I wanted to also ask for you, so for anyone watching who's not that familiar with the terms of accessibility as well. So we've kind of covered a little bit about equity and equality and diversity and inclusion. But how does accessibility come into that?
I guess really, I think accessibility is the degree to which, we make something available to a person, a group, a population, whether that's our customers, clients, patients. So how available is what we're doing for the people that we're doing it for, right? And I think really when it comes to accessibility, it does look slightly differently depending on your organization, where you're coming from. So if you're a tech company, for example, it's going to be all written in, it'll all be to do with the website, clicking around, buttons, colors, all that kind of stuff. If you're an artistic and creative organization, for example, you might be looking at different ways to engage people in your group sessions, in your group work, in your facilitation, that kind of thing. So it really is a little bit variable in terms of the organization that you're in, but in under general terms, it's about who are you working with, who would you like to be working with, and what do you need to do to make your work available for those people. I guess this is where I'll bring in a little bit of my lived experience. I am a neurodiverse person. I was diagnosed as an adult with ADHD. Largely, I like to think of it as a superpower. It does work a lot in my favor in many, many ways, but also there are tough days. It is a disability and it can feel very disabling on the toughest of days. Now, though I do have plans in place and I'm quite structured and organized, and I think my friends, family, and professional people that know me will probably say I'm one of the most organized people that they know. That hasn't always been the case. It's something I've had to learn. Now, when we're talking about inclusive practice and we're talking about accessibility, somebody like me, for example, if you're working with a neurodiverse person, you might be looking at what are the symptoms of their condition, because it's a lifelong condition. It doesn't go away. You're born like this. It's the way that your brain has developed. So how would you get the best out of those people? Because neurodiverse people can bring a lot to the table. We're very creative. We can be very innovative, think outside the box. We can be very practical, very, very compassionate in our approaches, and we can be very confident in various situations and adaptable. So, that's just a few of the traits that neurodiverse people can have. However, that title sometimes, and this goes with all disabilities and anybody who might identify as a minority person, as soon as that title is said, what people often do is they see the title and they don't see the gifts behind the title. And I would argue with anybody by saying, all people living with disabilities, I think they've all got exceptional traits, qualities, and abilities. Like, we can't just see the disability. We can't just see the person who's in a wheelchair, for example. We have to acknowledge it and work with that, of course. But for me, I'm never going to just look at somebody as a wheelchair-bound person or somebody who might have a long-term illness. I'm going to want to know that person and who they are and what they can do. And this is what we're talking about when it comes to person-centered practice, right? If you truly value diversity in your workplace, you will get to know the people that you have in your team. These people, no matter what their background are, they're not inconvenient. They can actually be an asset to your organization. So what are you going to do to engage those people powerfully and bring them on board in your organization to make sure that you can celebrate the gifts that these people are bringing? Yeah, because for a lot of people who come from minority backgrounds, who have disabilities, whether that's learning disabilities, neurodiversity, or physical disabilities, or people of color, we're talking maybe pregnant women, whatever the person that we're dealing with that comes with a protected characteristic. Really, what we're looking at there, or what we should be looking at, is, okay, who are we working with? How can we listen best to these people? Like, what do we have to do to allow their voices to come forward and to work with what their skills and talents and abilities, and also their lived experiences? They can be really transformational, because they could have an insight into something in our business or our organization that we might not have even thought of. And there's been many times I've sat in meetings, programs. I used to be a teacher many years ago, and I've saw neurodiverse children, both at FE, which is further education, and in secondary schools. They're incredible. Like, people who come with any protected characteristic have a lot to say. But sadly, if they feel that they aren't safe in the environment where they are, whether that's in the workplace or the classroom, for example, then they're probably not going to speak. So there can be an assumption, and it's a dangerous assumption actually, that people who come from minority backgrounds or have a protected characteristic don't have a lot to bring. It's a very dangerous assumption to make. And unfortunately, I've been in environments where that has been the case, and I've had to fight for my rights and fight for my place, my seat at the table, as anybody who identifies, from a minority background might agree with and might have experienced themselves as well.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for kind of sharing a little bit more about your experience as well. And that kind of elucidates somewhat the value of lived experience and engaging with people. And I think that is a really important part when we talk about accessibility. Something that is really crucial to recognize here is what can be lost when we don't engage in accessibility and accessible practices for the individual who wants to participate, wants to share their knowledge, wants to share their experience, and also wants to be valued and as an equal and integral part of something, but also from the perspective of an organization that's otherwise missing out on their great expertise that someone not from that background simply cannot offer. There is no other source for this expertise and this experience than those who have lived it. And I think that's really important to recognize, because we can often, I think, become maybe distracted with what seems like easier options, thinking, oh, well, if I just do enough research, then I can do it. I can imagine what this person might say or what their needs might be. And yes, absolutely do the research and certainly try and learn. But don't ever think that that's a substitute for actually engaging with people who have this lived experience themselves.
Yeah, I've got a good example actually that happened in recent years. I was dealing with an agency, and I'm going to use this example just to highlight to you all how very present direct and indirect discrimination can be for people from protected characteristics. And this particular agency had asked me to fill in quite a number of forms. There was about 20 forms to fill in, and I highlighted the difficulties that I was having with quite a senior manager actually, and told them I was neurodiverse, told them what I struggled with, what the symptoms were, not because I was trying to make anybody feel guilty or was trying to make anybody feel bad. It was trying to educate people so that they knew how to help me. That's all I was trying to do. And I got a very defensive attitude back, very defensive. I was talked over on the phone. I heard quite an irate person at the end of the phone, and I just very calmly said to this person, look, what is it about my disability that offends you? Because what I'm trying to do, and all I'm trying to do, is ask for what I'm entitled to. What I'm asking for is reasonable adjustments. Can somebody help me with some of this paperwork? I can even come into the office. Now, that really took a lot of courage for me to ask for that and to say in that way to this person. But, you know, the impact that had on me mentally afterwards was tremendous. It really sent me in a very awful mental space, because what it made me feel like was that I wasn't worthy of being a part of that agency, who, by the way, used the title several times that they were one of the best in the country. And I highlighted to them that to be the best in the country, you have to be operating at a high-level agenda. And a high-level agenda means that you're seriously considering inclusivity, equality, and diversity.
Yeah.
And what that really means is doing the work. Don't say that you're excellent if you're not doing the work. Because we all have to do the work to get to the excellence, right?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good example as well of acknowledging, you know, we can't put all of the work on, you know, it's important to involve people, and it's important to involve those with lived experience so that we can learn from their expertise. But it's not the job of the person who has been minoritized to explain and argue and carve the path for them to then have space and be listened to and be included. That work needs to be taken on by the organization. You know, if we're talking about this in organizational terms, that work needs to be taken on by the organization. And so for you to have to do the fighting there, and for you to have to say, okay, you know, that's exceptional anyway, to have the level of self-awareness and have done the practice to know this is what I need to get the best out of myself, and therefore the best for you as an organization. And for you to have that knowledge and offer it and have done the work internally to identify those things, that's a huge battle. What we're then asking for is simply for the organization themselves to understand that there's then work on their part to do, to accept simply accept that information with kind of open arms and as a way of learning, and with curiosity and with a real attention and kind of intention to create a space that then enables you to be the best for yourself, for the organization. And yeah, I think it's just important to highlight that, as you did, that it's when we're working with people with lived experience, it's not then that, the full work is for them to educate us as an organization. That needs to go hand in hand, and for you to go through that experience, for anyone to go through that experience, to not only do the work to learn about how to make spaces more accessible for you, but to then have to advocate for yourself against resistance. Like, emotionally, that's a difficult, that requires a huge amount of strength and bravery. And like you say, the kind of repercussions of that can really linger and kind of be detrimental. So I think that's kind of, we then come on to a little bit, how do we embed this then? How do we embed this practice in the workplace? And that's why we're really focusing today on policies and practices, of course, and process, policies that underpin that.
Yeah.
And so we have covered a bit here about why we must consider ED&I and accessibility in the workplace generally. And I'd like to also ask kind of how, in particular, policies can be useful to underpin that and to kind of embed that in practice.
Yeah, I think something really important that you've just highlighted there, Valentina, which, I mean, if there's anything that anybody could take away from this, it's what I'm about to say, is you don't have to be an expert in working with people with lived experiences or people from a minority background or the protected characteristic. All you need to do is show a willingness to learn and do the work that it takes to help that person. Now, the work starts with working with that person. And that's where we maybe talk a little bit about later in the conversation about what participation is and how you can do that safely with people. But as Valentina was also saying, there is, when we're thinking about our policies, it's about, well, what policies should we have in place to be working with our people in the best possible way? Because if you get your policies right, you're going to have staff retention. You're going to keep people for a number of years. I'll use an example here. I've worked, again, very recently with an organisation called Peak Ecology. I think Jonathan might be watching this. If he's not, he's certainly going to be listening back. Jonathan Brickland, shout out to Jonathan Brickland. He's a consultant ecologist, and he has a team of fantastic staff at Peak Ecology. And just recently, we were having a very serious conversation around policy in his workplace. And what he was saying is, being very honest, I feel he felt out of his depth about what does he need to do to support his staff with his mental health. But he followed that very quickly with, Dez, I'd like a conversation with you because I want to know how I can be better and what I need to do. And the conversations went along the lines of me advising Jonathan about what he could do in his workplace and exploring together collaboratively about what that would look like for his workplace and for his staff. And we had a bit of a training day. We listened to the voices of his staff, and we got a few ideas down, and he's implemented quite a few of those things. And one of them is a real great starting point. He worked with myself and his team to put a reasonable adjustments plan in place for some of his members of staff that needed it. And basically, they, as far as I can tell, feel seen, heard, and listened to by their manager. And he's very compassionate. He will literally do what he needs to do to make things accessible and to create flexibility around his working practices and their daily roles. And I've never met somebody so passionate about making this change. And yet he was willing enough to show his vulnerability and say, hey, I'm not very experienced in this area, but help me. Where can I go? What can I do? What kind of accreditations can I look into? And that for me was a big eye opener. And it gave me hope, really, that there are leaders out there that are willing to do that. You can be vulnerable. It's okay to be vulnerable and say you don't have all the answers. But what's really quite admirable is that you're willing to use that vulnerability to learn. And another positive experience I had, again, just to highlight to you guys what this looks like, is a lady called Annalise Pennington. She might not be listening to this. I have sent her the link, but she's very, very busy. Annalise works for an organisation called the Big Life Group. And last year I was applying for a fund to do with a service that I've set up. And I couldn't access the application process because I found it quite difficult with some of the traits of my ADHD. And I'd emailed Annalise. I said, look, I really want to apply for this. This is my idea. This is what I want to do. I'm very passionate. However, it's inaccessible because this, and this. This is how it could help me. And I sent a few suggestions, and she emailed me back after a week and completely changed the whole application process to make it accessible for me. I'm not going to lie when I say this, it brought me to tears because that's the first time in my life that I felt somebody actually showed up and recognized that here is a person that could do a great job if we just tweak some of the things or the way in which we're asking for this information. Now, unfortunately, at that time, I'd run out of time because there's a lot going on, so I didn't actually get the application process. But we are in conversation at the moment about doing another application, and I just can't thank Annalise and her team enough. It was really powerful that they were willing to listen. And so my message really to anybody who's listening to this is you can make changes. It doesn't have to be hard work. If you show willingness and you create a safe space for the people that you're working with to come forward and say, hey, you know what, I'm interested. I want to know who you are and I want to know what your struggle is. And let's have a conversation together and let's together create this change. You will have a big buy-in from that person, your member of staff, and they'll probably work 2, 3 times harder than what they did before because they felt valued, they felt heard, they felt seen, and they feel a part of that process. So there's a co-ownership thing going on there, right? And this is what I really value in the workplace. And I think if everybody operated in that way, you'll start to see huge shifts in the people that you're working with.
Certainly. You've really beautifully highlighted the value of humility and vulnerability and, being able to release ourselves from the expectation of having to know everything, and that if we're going to do something, we have to already know how to do it before we do it, and actually just asking for help. so incredibly valuable, and being willing and open then when that expertise and that experience is offered to you, to take that on board and not kind of have an immediate resistance as though with the assumption it's going to be too hard to do something differently, to change a process is going to be too hard, and therefore it's just easier to stick to the old way and the less inclusive way. And that actually things are changing all of the time. The industries are changing all of the time. Policies, processes are changing all of the time. People are changing all of the time. Our world is changing at such a fast rate that needs are developing and changing in response to those changes as well. So to respond as it happens, as you get that advice, and just actively have this consistent creation and recreation process in participation with those with lived experience and with expertise, means that you're always going to be actually kind of saving yourself work in the long term, because there won't need to be such a radical overhaul, and you're also kind of you're protecting yourself as an organization, but you're also protecting the experience of others who may end up being harmed at the hands of uninclusive policies, or exclusive policies and practices.
And harm can be very significant. It can last a whole entire lifetime, like be under no illusion how much of an impact that can have on somebody's life. Things like microaggressions, miscommunication, misuse of words, phrases, like people who come from minoritized backgrounds and, have protected characteristics or are vulnerable in some way, shall we say, they get all of these awful incidences happening to them every single day, and it's just another chipped off them, if you want to term it that way. Like, so we need to avoid these things at all costs. And as I said earlier, like, nobody can be an expert, but if you're willing to do the learning, and I use the phrase quite often actually, and everyone I've worked with and who knows me will probably agree when I say this, is that one of my key terms that I say all the time with the people that I'm working with is, I'm not an expert. So I know you put it in the title, but I am not an expert. And the reason I'm not an expert is because I'm always learning. I'm experienced. I have a wealth of knowledge and experience, but I don't know it all. And the way that I like to look at things is, if I know I don't know something, I'm going to do that learning and do that work to learn it. And if I, need to connect with somebody in particular who's going to help me with that, I absolutely will. So as leaders, as people who work for organizations, run your own companies, your businesses, your services, I guess my message and what I'm saying right now is, have a think about who you can work with and who can help you to gain that knowledge. And don't be afraid to use that phrase as well to your staff, because again, that shows your vulnerability. That takes away this ego dynamic, this power. It's a power shift. I'm not doing to you. As managers, you have a role to fulfill, of course. But if you can build a dynamic with your staff where you're working with them like that on some sort of compassionate, equal level, where there's equal contributors from both sides of the party, you're far more likely to get better results. And like I say, longer staff retention, people working harder, people showing a better willingness and an interest in the work that they're doing because they feel seen, heard, and listened to. When I was a manager, I did that for all of my team. I would regularly make that time to listen to their suggestions. I wouldn't go in with my suggestion first. I would wait to be the last one to speak, because working with a team, I had to listen out what was playing out in that room, what was playing out in people's minds, what were they experiencing. And when I could understand what they were experiencing, then I could come in with my view and think, well, where can I come in to help with this? As a manager, as a leader, what can I do to help in this situation? Sometimes we'd have a facilitated group discussion, either there and then I would plan it. Sometimes it would be in a one-to-one, or sometimes I would have to go externally and talk to somebody outside of the workplace and think, okay, who can help me with this? So, for example, I was working with somebody who had OCD. I didn't know anything about OCD, though I learned from this person what that was, how it played out in the workplace. But then I thought, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go reach out to a professional organization and get some advice about this. So I went to a professional organization and I got the advice that I needed, and I implemented that in my own working practice with this person. And I was able to turn some things around for that person, and it made the workplace and the environment a little bit more accessible for them because I was thinking about what their needs were.
I think you've given such a great example there of how to kind of balance these different avenues of participation and, I suppose, research, and that we want to create spaces, as you have done as a manager, but also kind of working in this field, for people to speak up and to do so without fear of judgment, without putting your ideas first and essentially asking someone to come up with a better one, or to preempt anything with your own ideas, but actually to just listen really, truly with open ears to what's being suggested and brought up. And I think it's nice you also mentioned kind of doing this in one-to-ones, but also maybe facilitating groups. And I think also very important to recognize, as we've kind of mentioned, the limit of what's reasonable to expect one individual to share in terms of expertise, and actually gone to an outside organization or an external partner to gain some of that expertise from someone who does it as their job. And I'd also like to just kind of follow up with that a little. I wonder if you have any other tips or guidance around how to enable staff or people with lived experience to participate in the creation of policies and the adjustment of processes in a way that is accessible, that's not tokenizing, but that allows someone really the space to kind of speak in a way that is safe, that feels safe for them.
I think one of the fundamental things that I've always worked with, and so far so good, it's gone quite well actually, on various levels with different people. It's different with everyone, right? But I think is looking at what's the collective values of the people that I'm working with. So you've got your organizational values, but then you have your team and them as individuals and what they stand for. Like, what are the values of your team members, right? Like, what do they love? What do they live by? Like, what motivates them? What demotivates them? So having a healthy conversation. Sometimes it can be non-work based actually, because you still can pull out these values from people. Like away days, for example, is a good one that you can use to get these values. So I think for me, I was always interested in understanding the life experiences that my colleagues had. I was interested in understanding who they are, what they stood for, like why they're doing their work. Basically, it's about curiosity. Like, get curious about the people that you're working with, because if you can exercise your curiosity, then really that's quite powerful, because that gives you some excellent tools to be able to be working with to bring out the best in the people that you're working with and for. Now, do you notice how I didn't say to there? Because if you work to your people, that means there's a power dynamic of, hierarchical behaviors. There's a time and a place for that, but most of the time we don't need to be hierarchical with the people that we're working with. If you can get that dynamic right, and that's, again, very individualized for every team and every leader, but I would really strongly encourage people to try to work towards that level of cohesive working, that collaborative approach, because that, for me, in my experience, is where the best work has happened with my staff, my colleagues, my clients. It's very much working with them. So yeah, I think that's really important, is looking at values, looking at where we can come together with those. Like, what does that look like? Or picking a few that are very common, like, let's see what's coming up here in this space. Because there might be a value that comes forward that's nearly all of your staff are talking about. Like, get that in your policies, get that in the way that you work with people, because it's going to cement them into the work, and you're going to get a whole level of new commitment there. I think as well, I wrote some things on a list here, so I'm looking at the ones that I think are best appropriate. Communications as well, I think, is really important. Like, how are you communicating with your staff members, your colleagues? What channels are you using? Are you using digital systems? Are you operating with mentor buddy systems? Do you have champions, EDI champions, neurodiverse champions? One organization I was working with before had several champions for different particular groups of people, because that was what was in our workplace. And, you can create safe forums. So maybe safe coaching spaces as well. I've engaged in coaching groups before. I'm a professional coach, so there's been times where I've had to go into places and work with people and coach them quite deeply through certain topics or subjects or barriers to their engagement or their pieces of work. So it could be that you facilitate something like that. Is there a leader with particular experience that can come in to help with something? So yeah, communications, newsletters is another one, surveys. Oh gosh, there's so many. You could get people together in certain groups and explore certain topics and have a little bit of a trade-off of knowledge and experience. Training for managers, I would say it's quite an obvious one. Like all managers, or well, most managers should be receiving training. But what training are your managers receiving? Because in my experience, when managers are getting training for their particular issues that they're going to be dealing with in their teams, say, for example, underperformance, it's quite boring, but they're not bringing in lived experience perspective. So again, I'm bringing in lived experiences here, because if you have a training course in a classroom or in a room where you're going to talk through some of these fundamental principles of management practice, how about bringing a couple of lived experience representatives into that space to talk about, hey, look, this is how this affected me. This is how it impacted on my life. This is how it impacted on my work. But if these changes were put in place, this is how it could have dramatically changed my performance. Because, I mean, what that might look like is like a small panel, for example. I mean, you'd have to do this safely and talk to the people in the panel, prepare them and that kind of thing. But it's something I suggested recently to an agency because of the nature of the work that they were doing. And what I said is, if you were able to listen to a couple of people with these particular issues, I say issues, it's not really an issue, it's a lived experience, then you might be able to see how that plays out in your practices, because you're getting an idea of something, but you've got no experience of it. But talking to the people gives you an experience of it, and it gives you a story that you can take with you to really powerfully understand why it's important to make those changes. So another one is, most workplaces have equal opportunities policies, but like what is in that policy and where did that information come from, right? Did you just copy and paste that off something on the internet, or did you, again, work with your staff, work with your workforce to understand what equality means to them? Because there's equality in a broader sense, but then there's equality in your industry and organization. Like, what does that mean? Ask that question, go there in the team meetings and listen, write ideas down, feedback to your staff, go back to them and say, hey, this is what the summary is. This is what I'm hearing. This is what we picked up. And be honest with them. Don't say to your staff that you're going to do something if you can't do it. Just say that to them. Look, it might take us some time to do this, but this is what we're valuing, and this is where we'd like to go, but we'll keep you updated. Timely updates are really important. That helps people feel that they've been recognized, seen, heard, and listened to. And it keeps the momentum going of their engagement as well. It thinks, wow, I'm going to stay here, because things are moving forward. People want to see things moving forward, even in tiny, small steps, right? And then there's meaningful involvement. Like, how are you going to involve your staff in these changes that you're proposing? And are you proposing the changes, or are they proposing the changes? Again, the power shift and dynamic, right?
Absolutely. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, and it's like, you can have an idea, but hear your staff out first. And then you can maybe share your idea, and maybe it'll change by the time you've heard the circle of people in front of you.
Absolutely. And I think, it's having that open conversation, and we talk a lot at Elite Mind about creating these this loop of feedback, or a feedback loop. But essentially it's this multi-way communication, kind of vertically, horizontally, in the creation and co-creation of all working practices and policies, is that we want to have this ability for free expression about experience within the workplace, without fear of negative repercussions from sharing, say, experiences of discrimination or microaggressions, favoritism, stereotyping, those kinds of things that can come up in the workplace. And it's important to acknowledge, as you have here, is that when these things happen, often those who have caused them or who have kind of enacted those microaggressions don't know what they've done, don't know the harm that it can cause, and kind of we're not here to make anyone feel guilty. We don't want to create more bad feelings. The point is here to highlight areas of learning and show that we have experience and want to kind of better the workplace for everyone. And that feedback isn't about placing blame or creating shame. It's about bettering the experience in the workplace for everyone. And kind of having that humility to really listen to those experiences, take them on, and adapt and respond in a constructive rather than defensive way is what actually creates that change and creates that feeling of momentum and inclusivity, whereby you're right, people want to stay places longer because they can see that they're being valued, that their experience is being considered. And that's really, really useful. And something I also wanted to kind of ask your thoughts on here, Des, is, we've been talking a lot about policies and how to create them accessible in terms of participation and also in terms of how their application in the workplace. So policies that are designed to make the workplace more accessible. But also, I think it's really important to highlight the accessibility of the policy itself. So can someone, any employee in any position of an organization, find and understand a policy that might be related to them and know exactly how to, say, ask for or enact that policy, if, say, it's for reasonable adjustments or maternity or, religion and belief, whatever that may be. But not only is the policy inclusive in terms of what it dictates around practices, but actually how well can that be understood? Because I know that kind of from our research, a lot of the time when we ask people about, do you know how to find policies, where to find them, and do you understand them? A lot of the time, it's not always that kind of clear a yes with that. And actually that being able to interpret the policy itself can be a barrier in it being able to be enacted.
Yeah, I mean, so what we're talking about here really is one of the fundamental things is language. Like, how are we working with language in policy? Now, for example, if you have a workforce that it has a large percentage of, say, Southeast Asian heritage individuals, and a minority proportion of your workforce might be, say, white British individuals, but your policies are aimed at white British individuals in terms of their language, then you've got a problem, right? I'm using this as just an example I've just pulled out of my head. But surely it'd be worth engaging with the populations that you're working with and asking them, is this okay? Is my language okay? And this is something, again, I've done before, is, okay, what language do we need to incorporate here and why? Like, what are the important things we need to know? What phrases are banned? What phrases should we not say? What do we need to be aware of? Again, we all make mistakes. Some people do it innocently. I've done it myself. I'm not perfect, but when I've made a mistake and I've realized I've made a mistake, I say I've made a mistake. I apologize that I've made the mistake. And I say, how can I be better? What do I need to do as an individual, as an employee, as a leader? How can I be better? I've done that with many people before, and that's my time to be quiet and time to listen. And what they tell me is how I'm going to navigate the next part of that policy, that conversation, that process, that procedure. Because do you know what? In my experience as well, as a person with neurodiverse condition, I will say there's been many times I've read processes and policies and procedures, and it hasn't been fit for purpose for the way that I interpret information sometimes. Like, I'm very visual. Sometimes reading, for a quick example of this is reading long bodies of text for me can be quite physically painful. Like, I have to either cut and paste it so it's in small blocks so that I can understand it and I can read it, or I have to have a reader to read it out to me. So I use some software to read it out to me. Or if I summarize information and put it on post-it notes or something like that, then I can interpret it and I can read it and I can acknowledge it just like any other person. But I have to work differently with long pieces of text. So I'll give you an example. If I've got a report that's 5 pages long, I have to split that up somehow. I might have to use different colors to highlight the sections, and somehow, I don't know why, but it makes it so much easier to read. So this is what we're talking about in terms of accessibility: is who is the person that needs to access that policy, and how can you support them? So probably managers might need to do this, but how can you support them openly to access that policy in a way that works for them? You know, and not just the language, but in terms of like, what's the process that works for them?
Yeah, absolutely. The process of understanding the policy in terms of what format that comes to them, what it looks like, where they find it. Is it paper? Is it on an intranet? Is it, you know, in a shared folder or kind of sent in an email? All of these things really do, and they may seem kind of superfluous or, you know, unimportant, but actually these can be the first barriers to access. And so it really is very important to consider these things and to make sure that there's ways that these policies can be accessed by the people that need them, as you say.
I'll tell you something that one of my managers has done in the past as well, is they actually printed the policy off that I needed. Takes no amount of time. And then she guillotined the policy in sections and gave me the policy with a paperclip on top. And I was able to access that and follow the policy fully in no amount of time. So what might have took a couple of minutes, probably 5 minutes it took her to do that out of her day, but I was able to do that work to an excellent standard like everybody else. And this is what we're talking about. That's what it looks like in practice. It's not about going the extra mile, because you shouldn't really be going the extra mile. Because to me, if you say I'm going the extra mile, you're kind of doing something way out of the ordinary, right? We should just be doing this as a standard practice. Know who you're working with, know your team, know your people, and know who you're working with and how to make things work for them.
Absolutely. Really, that does emphasize, again, this kind of person-centered approach. And the more we do that, the more we learn how to accommodate others. You know, that person having done that for you once, next time that they encounter someone with similar needs, might just know, okay, is it easy? Is it helpful if I print it off and guillotine it out? Or is it helpful if I put some things in bold? Or is it helpful if I give you an audio description of it? Then, you know, you build up this repertoire of ways that you can make things more accessible, and then it doesn't feel like the extra mile. It just feels like one of many options of conveying that information.
Yes.
And I kind of wanted to ask as well, just quickly, I'm kind of aware of time here, there's always so much that we want to talk about. But do you have any suggestions for kind of specific, if an organization is looking at this and thinking, okay, thank you, I'm aware I need to create some policies here that we don't have, where should they start? What are some specific policies that organizations could really do with kind of beginning with to make their workplace more accessible?
So the first one that comes to my mind, I've used this several times. It is an American website though, so I'm aware. Is it just UK listeners that we've got, or people from all over the world?
All over, yeah.
Yeah. So it is an American website, but you can use it. I'm based in the UK, so I had to interpret it into the way of working in the UK, but it was still very, very useful. You'll see if you go onto it. It's called askjan.org. And basically what that does is it's there's a search box at the top of it, and you type in the condition, the disability, whatever it is that you're working with. So if you've got an individual that said to you, I've got OCD, I've got ADHD, you type that in and it comes up with a list of suggestions for reasonable adjustments to work with that person. Now, as I say, interpret it in your own way, in your own culture. You know, it is American, so some of the terms are American on there, but I still found it incredibly useful. So that's the first thing I would say. So askjan.org. It's been a lifesaver for me in terms of how I create various documentation and how I hold meetings as well, sometimes with particular people, and even just presenting it to the person saying, look, I found this information. Would any of this help you? Even just by saying that to the person, they're going to be like, wow, you went out of your way to learn about me and my thing. That's really amazing. Thank you. And so that's first thing. You could look at things like, an obvious one, it might not be so obvious to everybody, but Human Equality and Human Rights Commission. I've got a lot of information. You Google them. There's legislation and procedures and all kinds of suggestions on there, so you might want to look at that. There's an organisation called Inclusive Employers, which I'd strongly recommend that people check out. They have various bits of advice on there. I think they've got a membership, like a scheduled membership of different levels that you can, if you wanted to become a member to get excellent resources and extra support, then that's obviously on offer there. I'm aware some people that might be listening might be working for health services, not necessarily businesses and other industries. So for anyone who's working for health services, I would say that the NHS has useful guides on participation practice, and they're clinical based. So if you're working with like mental health problems, or you're working with lived experiences of trauma or anything like that, particularly in your service, I would say that those guides are quite useful. Again, you can Google that. It's called the NHS Long-Term Plan Adult Social Care Reform Paper. I had to write that down because I could never remember that off the top of my head, but I know what it is. I've worked with it and looked at it before. And I've downloaded that as a PDF, and it's really, really useful. National Voices, the Coalition of Healthcare for Charities in England, is another one. So again, that's a small network of, I think it's a large network actually, of different diverse voices coming together to address certain issues. So you might want to use them to get some advice. We've got the Independent Mental Health Network. I've worked with them before. They were absolutely brilliant. They are Southern based in the UK. That's a network of lived experience representatives who are adults, and they come together to support organisations with questions and answers based around certain accessibility issues. So how their work is the organisation pays for a number of these representatives to come along, and they work with them to address key questions in their policy writing or in their procedures. ACAS in the UK is an amazing resource I've used before as a manager. They kind of help you with various legalities, legislation, UK law around protecting people and not discriminating against them. Anybody who identifies as LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or other, if you work with any employees of those particular backgrounds, you might want to check out the LGBT Foundation UK-based. Stonewall's a really good one as well. If you go on Stonewall's website, they've got a list of all of the terms and references and things that you can look out for. So if you're worried about language, we were talking about language, it's just one small example. It's really worth checking that out to see how you can be a little bit more inclusive in how you're using language around your LGBT employees. The ADHD Foundation for me has been absolutely massive. They are so brilliant and so wonderful and so accommodating. They've got loads of accommodation, not accommodations, they've got loads of publications on the website, and they've got a FAQ section as well, so that's quite useful. National Autistic Society is a great one. Job Accommodations Network, that's the one I mentioned earlier, the Ask Jan. The Neurodiversity Network, that is, it's a government resource, so if you go into gov.uk, this is UK-based, people who are listening, there's some information on there. What else have we got? Diversity, inclusion, and neurodiversity in the workplace. We've got the National Centre for Learning Disabilities, the Institute for Management and Learning. That's a really good one. Sometimes there's courses advertised on there as well. Diversity Best Practices and Society for Human Resource Management, which for any HR professionals that might be listening, you might be aware of that one already, but that's always a good resource. What we're talking about here really is we're looking at who are the experts. I know I've said earlier that none of us are experts because we're all learning, but there's people that have particularly more knowledge than us, right? So we're going to those places and spaces and people and saying, hey, we want some of that knowledge because we want to learn. And that's what we're talking about, is reaching out for the learning.
Thank you. That's such a helpful list. And I know, for anyone who's listening might be trying to furiously write all those down, don't worry, we're going to kind of paste them in the comments or somewhere else to make sure that you can kind of access those in one place as well. Thank you so much, Des. I think that's so fantastic and really worthwhile to kind of flag these external organizations that have done a lot of this work already, and we should absolutely be kind of utilizing their expertise as well. Kind of just before we wrap things up, would you tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing with ED&I or with accessibility, or kind of more widely generally as well? And if any organizations do want to contact you, how can they do so?
Yeah, so it's a bit of an interesting one, really. I've had quite a mixed background professionally. I've worked in teaching, education, predominantly mental health care, safeguard and support for the last 10 to 15 years. But my real passion and my heart is in nature and recovery. And I guess, a couple of years ago, I began a small service. It's still developing. Lots is going on. We're hopefully moving it forward in the right direction. We've got some funding options and various people and organizations that I'm having conversations with. But essentially, I started it's a small service called Relax Rewild. And what that's about is about using my knowledge as a person with lived experience and who has previously struggled tremendously with clinical depression in my 20s. I'm now 11 years in recovery and having worked for a long time in mental health services. I'm using all of that knowledge to safely work with people in outdoor settings and using nature as a tool for recovery and a pathway for recovery, and working with qualified professionals like counselors and therapists to offer something different, to take people out into the wild, connect them back to themselves, a little bit of transformative coaching as well. And I'm really passionate about that. We're making some headway, and we've had some fantastic feedback and results from people who have engaged with our work, our courses, our workshops. And it's really a privilege to be there in that space. And, I've talked a lot about person-centered practice here in today's call. And myself apply a lot of those principles. It's something that's very close to my heart. And I think because I've experienced it myself, I'm able to think along those lines naturally now. So by default, I always think, how can this be accessible? How can I interact with this person who's coming to my workshop just to find out a little bit extra about them? Can I change something in the way that I'm going to deliver this? And I do it every time. And the engagement levels have been tremendous because of that. So yes, it's a little bit of extra work, but I, for one, will never shy away from that. I'm a hard working person, and I'm willing to put in that graft and do that learning, do that work to work with the people that I want to support and help. And, in the long term, the benefits of that are that the people reach recovery quicker and they're able to get on and become independent and find their pathway. And get to that place of recovery that I'm in a privilege to be in now.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And that sounds so truly wonderful, and such a needed service, I think, as well, kind of engaging with recovery through nature and access to the wild. I think it's such a healing practice. So anyone who kind of hears that, wants to be involved, please do reach out to Dez. It's kind of, I know you say that it's in the making, it's developing, so it sounds like there's a lot more to come, and to absolutely stay tuned on how that is developing. And for anyone interested as well in services with Elite Mind, we can also support with reviewing policies and helping with the co-creation process to develop and recreate policies as well in response to employee needs, understanding employee needs, and building those into policies to make sure that they are inclusive and accessible. Any last words, Des, kind of before we wrap up? It's been such a pleasure having you here today, and I, as I said, could kind of go on and on, but yeah, any kind of last words to wrap up for our audience?
I said this earlier on, but I'll say it again, is if you do what you've always done, you get what you've always got. So if you're getting the same results and the same issues over and over again, just try a different approach and be brave and be bold and put yourself out there. Ask the right questions, do the right things, open your ears and close your mouth, and that's really powerful. And I think anybody who applies those basic principles will get some really astonishing results.
Amazing. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better. Thank you so much, Des. And for everyone else, we will catch you next